The gardens that bloomed beneath stone in the year 1923, in the heartland of ancient Mesopotamia, an archaeologist's hands trembled as they held a discovery so small it fit in a child's palm. A terracotta vessel, burnished clay, bearing patterns intricate, deliberate patterns of plants that no botanist could name. The scholar turned it slowly in the lamplight, studying the inscriptions that spiraled across its surface like a prayer. And in that moment, a question emerged from the dust of centuries, soft and insistent as breath. Who knew how to grow what should not grow? And why did they choose to grow it where no light could reach? This is the mystery that whispers through the silence of the earth. This is the story of the Kemnu. It is said that between the whispered tales of Sumer and Akkad, in the spaces where history becomes legend and legend becomes dust, there existed a people who understood something that the surface world could not. They built no monuments to proclaim their greatness. They carved no kings into stone. They left no temples where priests could gather in morning light to sing their gods' names. Instead, the Kemnu chose invisibility, absolute, deliberate, sacred invisibility. And in that choosing, they created something far more mysterious than any palace or pyramid. They created an absence, a silence, a void that has echoed through millennia with questions we are only now beginning to ask. Beneath the earth they descended, deep into the bedrock, into chambers carved with the precision that speaks of absolute intention. These were not refuges built in haste. These were sanctuaries, designed with the meticulousness of a ritual, each space dimensioned and oriented with mathematical certainty. The walls themselves bear evidence of a culture so advanced in their understanding of architecture that they created chambers where water moved in channels that seemed to defy the laws of simple gravity, waterways that curved through darkness as if guided by invisible hands. The irrigation systems branched like veins, carrying moisture through the stone towards something kept perpetually in shadow. What did they grow in these gardens of darkness? Seeds in sealed jars. The Kemnu preserved them, thousands upon thousands of clay vessels, each one containing seeds that the modern world cannot identify. The archaeologists who followed in those footsteps of 1923 found them arranged in precise order, sorted by size, by weight, by some classification system that mirrors nothing in contemporary botanical knowledge. Were these seeds experiments? Were they offerings? Were they the preserved memory of plants that once grew in the light, kept as testimony, as prayer, as evidence of a world they had left behind? Inscriptions in a script that mirrors no known language. This is perhaps the most haunting evidence of all. The marks are clearly written, deliberate, refined, the work of scribes trained in a literary tradition that must have stretched back centuries. Yet they remain opaque. No scholar has cracked the Kemnu cipher. No Rosetta Stone has emerged to translate their words. And some whisper, in the quiet chambers of museums and universities, that perhaps the Kemnu wrote not to be read by the world above, but to speak only to themselves, to leave records for their own descendants, who would continue the sacred work in darkness, to create a literature of the unseen, a conversation that was never meant to be intercepted by history. Beneath the silence, a narrative emerges. Were they fleeing? Did some cataclysm, war, plague, the wrath of the gods above drive these people into the earth, compelling them to seek refuge in the stone? Or did they descend by choice, guided by a vision so powerful, so absolute, that the surface world became suddenly insubstantial? Some scholars believe they were astronomers who understood something about the cycles of the cosmos that drove them to preserve their knowledge in places untouched by the sun's degradation. Others suggest they were mystics, spiritual practitioners who believed that certain truths could only be cultivated in absolute darkness, that the absence of light was not a deprivation, but a gateway to inner illumination. What knowledge did they possess about life itself? What had they learned about the nature of growth, of consciousness, of the sacred process of becoming? Consider the evidence before you, as if you are holding that small terracotta vessel in the lamplight. The patterns on its surface suggest something extraordinary, a plant that grows without sunlight, fed instead by water that carries minerals from deep within the earth. An organism that relies not on the visible spectrum, but on something else, perhaps on the subtle energies that flow through stone, through water, through the darkness, where time moves differently. The Kemnu may have been conducting an experiment so profound that we are still struggling to comprehend it. They may have been asking, what lives when we remove everything we think is necessary? What grows in the absence of what we believe are the conditions for life? Whispers tell us that the chambers were beautiful. The few fragments of description that have survived in much later texts speak of walls polished smooth of acoustic property, so precise that a voice whispered in one chamber could be heard in another, carried through miles of stone, as if the rock itself had become a medium for communication. Imagine spaces designed for both cultivation and ceremony, places where the practical and the spiritual were one, where growing food and practicing meditation were indistinguishable acts. And then, silence. At some point, whether suddenly or gradually, the records do not tell, the Kemnu ceased their work. The chambers were sealed. The irrigation channels stopped flowing. The seeds in their jars were left untouched, waiting in the darkness for someone, someday, to discover them. The question that haunts us now is not whether the Kemnu vanished, but whether they chose to vanish. Did they complete their work? Did they achieve what they set out to accomplish? Did they ascend from the darkness, carrying with them the knowledge they had cultivated, leaving only this testimony, this beautiful, cryptic testimony in sealed chambers for a future that would not arrive for thousands of years? Some believe the Kemnu did not vanish at all. Some whisper that they remain in the earthen chambers we have not yet found, continuing their sacred work in the absolute darkness, still tending gardens that bloom without sun, still writing in a language that only their hearts can read. Consider, as you drift towards sleep, the profound nature of their choice. A civilization that chose to be forgotten. A people who engineered their own erasure from history, who deliberately stepped away from the light of the world and into the silence of the stone. Perhaps they understood something that we have forgotten, that the greatest knowledge cannot be proclaimed or conquered or displayed, that some truths are so sacred they can only be preserved in darkness, in sealed chambers, in the language of sealed lips. Beneath the silence, their voices echo still, in sealed jars, in irrigation channels that lead nowhere and everywhere, in a script that whispers secrets to those who have learned to listen with something deeper than words. It is said that on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the earth is still, if you press your ear to the stone in Mesopotamia, you might hear them. Not their voices, no. The Kemnu left no voices above ground, but the sound of water moving through darkness, the breath of soil exhaling, the ancient, patient growing of something sacred that has never known the sun. They did not vanish. They descended, and in their descent, they took with them a secret the world above was not meant to know. Yet we continue to search. We continue to listen. We continue to hold that small vessel in the lamplight, turning it slowly, asking the questions that have no answers. Perhaps, whispers the darkness, that is exactly as they intended. The city of 7 gates, that only one soul ever entered, those who walked the threshold in the year 1147, in a merchant's ledger bound in leather, that has long since turned to dust. There exists a record, not official, not archived in any great library, but preserved in the fractured memory of history, a journal written in trembling script by a man whose name we do not know, whose face remains forever invisible, but whose words have haunted scholars for nearly 9 centuries. He writes, "I have passed through 7 gates. I have spoken the words that should not be spoken. I have walked where time moves sideways, and I have seen what was never meant to be seen by human eyes. When I emerged, the city was gone, or perhaps I was." This is where our story begins, not with certainty, but with absence, not with names and dates and the architecture of verified history, but with whispers. Whispers that persist in fragmentary manuscripts, in marginalia scrawled in monks' hands, in the spaces between what is known and what is forgotten. Whispers of a city called Ashgahar. It is said that Ashgahar was not built as cities are usually built, not to house people, not to celebrate kings or gods or the permanence of human achievement. Instead, Ashgahar was designed as an elaborate lock, an entire city complete with walls and watchtowers and inner sanctuaries engineered as a mechanism, a puzzle, a barrier between the world and a knowledge so profound that it required 7 gates to contain it. And not merely gates of stone and iron. No, these were gates of consciousness, thresholds that existed in the space between the physical and the unseen, passages that demanded surrender, initiation, transformation. Imagine standing before the first gate at dawn. The light would be soft and uncertain. The gate itself would appear simple, a massive stone arch bearing inscriptions in a language that resembles all languages and none. The inscriptions would shimmer slightly when you gazed at them directly, becoming clearer when you looked away, as if they existed in the corner of perception rather than in material reality. This is the gate of questions. It is said that to pass through, you must ask a question, not any question, but the question that has haunted your soul since childhood. The question you never dared speak aloud. The question that contains the whole of your seeking. And as you ask it, the gate would recognize the authenticity of your longing and would open. Not with sound, but with the shifting of possibility. A doorway where before there was only stone. Whispers tell us that beyond this first gate lay a landscape that was not quite the landscape you had entered. The sky would be the same color, but the light would fall differently. The ground beneath your feet would be solid, but each step would feel like walking through water, not resistant, but yielding. And before you would stand the second gate. The gate of water. This is where the testimony becomes more fragmented, more difficult to trust. The trader's journal describes something that defies easy explanation. A gate constructed not of stone alone, but of something that resembled water frozen in perpetuity. Yet through the substance, one could see beyond, not clearly, but as if looking through deep ocean, seeing forms moving in impossible ways. He writes that to pass through this gate, one must relinquish the fear of drowning. One must surrender the notion that the body as you know it is solid. He describes a moment of dissolution, stepping into the substance of the gate and feeling his form disperse like salt dissolving in the sea, and then reconstitution, regathering, emergence into a space where his body felt more real than it ever had before, yet simultaneously more transparent. Each gate required something different. Each demanded a surrender of certainty. The gate of the starlit mirror appeared to be a vast circular opening, its surface reflecting not the world as it was, but as it might have been. The trader describes gazing into this mirror and seeing himself at different ages simultaneously, child and elder, warrior and scholar, the person he was and the person he might have become. To pass through this gate, he writes, one must recognize all these selves as equally true, must accept the multiplicity of one's own nature, must relinquish the illusion of singular identity. And then the fourth gate, the fifth, the sixth. The descriptions become increasingly difficult to parse. Words fail. The testimony fractures into poetry, into half-formed images, into suggestions and silences. He speaks of a gate where he encountered visions of civilizations that had not yet been born, cities of crystal and mathematics, societies that existed in states of consciousness we do not yet have language for. He speaks of a gate where time moved sideways, where past and future occupied the same space, and where he witnessed events that had not yet occurred and had always been occurring. He describes a moment of standing before the sixth gate and realizing that the gates he had passed through were not protecting something outside. They were protecting something within, and that something was him. I understood, he writes, that I was not entering a city. I was entering myself. And then, the seventh gate. His journal ends here. The final entry is brief, almost illegible, written in a hand that trembles with something beyond fear, with a, perhaps, or with the dissolution of the certainty that allows us to write clearly. I passed through. The city was not a city, but a cathedral of human memory. I saw what should not be seen. I understood what should not be understood. And when I emerged, I was no longer the person who had entered. The gates had done their work. They had not opened to let me in. They had opened to let me through. To let something through. The city's location has been lost to conquest and dust. Some say it stood in the high deserts of Central Asia, hidden in a valley that no longer exists on any map. Others claim it was buried beneath the sands of Mesopotamia, or concealed in the mountains of Anatolia, or hidden in some dimension that parallels our own. The truth is, Ashgalhar may have never existed as a physical place at all. It may have been a metaphor and elaborate symbolism for the spiritual journey, the initiatory passage, the death and rebirth that all seekers undergo when they walk the path toward illumination. Or perhaps it was real, perhaps it still stands somewhere beneath sand, beneath stone, beneath the surface of perception waiting. It is said that occasionally, someone would pass through, not to stay, not to claim the knowledge or the power or the secrets locked in the center, but to be changed by the passage itself, to have their consciousness transformed by walking through the 7 gates, to emerge as someone capable of holding a truth so large that it could not be contained in words, in books, in the ordinary structures of human knowledge. And these people, these transformed ones, would vanish back into the world, leaving only the faintest trace. A journal, a fragment, a rumor, a dream that felt too real to be imagined. The profound mystery at the heart of this story is not what Ashgahar contained, but why it was designed the way it was. Why build 7 gates? Why make the passage so difficult, so demanding, so utterly destructive of ordinary consciousness? And the answer that whispers through the fragmentary evidence is this: because knowledge without transformation is dangerous. Because truths that arrive without changing the person who receives them become weapons, tools of ego, sources of suffering. Ashgahar was built not to hide knowledge, but to ensure that only those who were willing to be utterly remade could access it. The 7 gates were not locks to keep people out. They were thresholds to ensure that only the truly devoted, the truly transformed, could enter. And in that understanding, we glimpse something sacred, something merciful, a civilization or a consciousness, or perhaps a myth that contains a deep truth, that understood that some knowledge is only safe when held by those who have already surrendered everything to receive it. Perhaps, the silence whispers, the gates are still standing. Perhaps they are always standing, in that dimension between the physical and the unseen, waiting for the next soul brave enough to ask the question that cannot be unasked, the question that begins the journey, the question that opens the first gate. And perhaps that gate is closer than we know. The Library of Ashes, what the fire consumed and what it revealed. Those who remember what was meant to be forgotten in the darkness of a museum basement, far from the light of public exhibition, there rests a stone tablet, blackened by ancient fire, fractured along one edge, bearing markings in 3 languages: Greek, Egyptian, something else entirely, that have been translated, debated, and ultimately left in silence by those who understand what they mean. The inscription reads, in what remains of its form, the knowing must end here. No museum catalog fully describes this artifact. Scholars whisper about it in hushed tones, in academic papers that are rarely cited, in conversations that occur only when certain doors are closed and certain voices can be trusted. Because this tablet is evidence of something that history would prefer to forget. It is evidence of a choice, a deliberate, coordinated, almost sacred choice to erase something from human knowledge. It is said that in the year 64 CE, in a city whose name has been lost so completely that we cannot say whether it stood in Egypt or Mesopotamia or some region that no longer exists on any map, there existed an archive. Not the great library of Alexandria, which the world remembers and mourns. This was something else. Something lesser known, yet infinitely more dangerous. It was called the Archive of Ptolemy, though whether it was named after the king or the astronomer or some other Ptolemy, history does not clearly tell. And within this archive, according to fragmentary accounts preserved in the margins of texts and suppressed writings and references quoted by later historians who themselves seemed reluctant to speak of it, within this archive lay something that transcended the ordinary understanding of what a library contained. Whispers tell us that the Archive of Ptolemy did not house scrolls of poetry or mathematics. It did not contain treatises on philosophy or chronicles of conquest. Instead, it contained what the ancients called the testimony of witnesses. And this phrase must be understood carefully, for it does not mean what we might think it means. These were not eyewitness accounts of ordinary events. These were detailed, exacting records written in precise language, with dates and coordinates and what appeared to be scientific notation of events that should not have been possible. Visions of futures that had not yet occurred, described in such detail that it seemed the writers had seen them directly. Records of civilizations that would not exist for thousands of years, yet documented with architectural precision, with knowledge of their languages, their astronomical systems, their spiritual practices, encounters with intelligences that were not human beings of light, perhaps, or entities existing in dimensions adjacent to our own. The archive contained descriptions of events that predated recorded history by vast spans of time, yet were recorded as if the writers had witnessed them firsthand. Consider, for a moment, what this would mean. Consider what it would do to the architecture of human history if such documents were to survive. If the boundaries of time could be crossed by knowledge, if the certainty that human civilization developed in isolation, step by step, could be undermined by the testimony of those who seemed to have seen beyond. Someone understood this danger. Someone made a choice. It is said that in the year 64 CE, a fire consumed the archive of Ptolemy, not gradually, not by accident, by design, by consensus. The fragmented evidence suggests that this was not the work of a single person, nor a moment of religious fervor, but an agreement of burning consensus, as it appears in one cryptic medieval text among scholars and keepers of knowledge, that certain records could not be allowed to survive, that some truths were too large, too destabilizing, too profound for human consciousness to bear. The fire was thorough, almost complete. The archive was razed so entirely that the location was lost. Legends about it faded into mythology. It became, for most of history, merely a rumor, a story, a whisper of something that may never have existed. Yet evidence persists. A charred page, recovered in the 19th century during an archaeological excavation, bears fragments of a text written in a hand that suggests formal training, systematic documentation. The visible words speak of the temporal cascade, the witnesses who stood outside time, the knowledge that must not propagate. The page itself is so fragile that only a handful of scholars have been permitted to examine it, and their reports have been carefully contained, their findings rarely published in accessible form. References appear in suppressed texts. A medieval monk, copying manuscripts in a monastery, inserted a marginal note, almost a confession, that reads, "I have seen the forbidden catalogue. I understand why they burned it. Some knowledge, once known, cannot be unknown. Some doors, once opened, cannot be closed." The rest of the margin has been deliberately scratched away, as if someone later came and attempted to erase even this oblique reference. Cryptic passages quoted by later historians speak of the archive's contents with the tone of reverence mixed with fear. One text describes the vision of the future city rendered in such perfect detail that the reader is seized with the terrible certainty that this future is inevitable, that it is already written, that we are merely walking a path that was decided before we were born. Another speaks of the encounter with the intelligence of light, whose words were so beautiful and so true that the soul of the reader was nearly translated into its form, nearly ceased to be human. The profound question that emerges from these fragments is this: what? Knowledge is so destabilizing that even the ancients, even those who were, by our measure, less rational, less scientific, more willing to accept mysteries, understood it must not survive. Perhaps they understood something we have forgotten. Perhaps they possessed a wisdom born of bitter experience, a knowledge that certain truths, when revealed too widely, do not liberate the human mind. Instead, they fragment it. They create despair. They undermine the capacity for human beings to act with purpose, to build, to love, knowing that everything they create is temporary and perhaps predetermined. Perhaps the ancients understood that ignorance is not always the opposite of wisdom. Sometimes ignorance is the foundation upon which a viable human life can be built. Or perhaps, and this possibility haunts the edges of the fragmentary evidence, perhaps the burning of the archive was not an act of mercy, but an act of silencing. Perhaps those who burned it did so not to protect humanity, but to protect power, to narrow the boundaries of what could be known and thought, so that only those in authority could control what truth was permitted to exist. Perhaps the archive contained knowledge that would have liberated rather than destroyed. And the fire that consumed it was the fire of suppression, of control, of a conscious narrowing of human possibility. The fire has left us suspended in a terrible uncertainty. It is said that ashes remember, that whatever is burned leaves an imprint in the air, a residue in the realm of spirit, a ghost that cannot fully be erased. And so, the contents of the archive of Ptolemy may still exist somewhere, not in stone or papyrus, but in the invisible spaces, waiting for someone to develop the capacity to perceive them, waiting for humanity to grow into the knowledge it was deemed unprepared to receive. Consider the stone tablet one final time. The knowing must end here. These words could mean so many things. A command, a plea, a confession, a warning, a prayer. Did they end the knowing to protect us? Or did they silence a voice that was calling us toward a truth too large, too magnificent, too transformative to be forgotten forever? The fire of 64 CE has long since cooled. The city is dust. The archive is ash. The scholars who made the burning consensus have been dead for nearly 2,000 years. Yet the question remains, hovering in the darkness like smoke that refuses to disperse. What did we lose in that fire? And more softly, more tenderly, as sleep begins to call, are we yet ready to know what was burned away? Or do we too need the mercy of forgetting? The threshold keepers, an order that left only echoes those who listened to what was never spoken. Imagine standing in a chamber carved into living rock, where no human has entered for thousands of years. The walls are smooth, polished by intention rather than time. Above your head, the ceiling curves in a perfect arc, not the result of accident or simple erosion, but of precise calculation. You speak a single word, softly, and the chamber responds. Your voice returns to you transformed not as an echo, but as a harmony, a resonance that seems to come from the stone itself. As if the rock has memory, as if the walls are singing something that was always there waiting to be released. This is where we begin, not with names or dates or the comfortable architecture of verified history, but with silence, with spaces, with the mystery of why certain chambers, separated by continents and centuries, seem to speak the same language. It is said that before monasteries rose with their ordered rhythms, before temples crowned the landscape with their proclamations of God and King, before religions found their names and their doctrines hardened into stone, there existed something older, an order, a calling, a purpose so unified and so profound that it moved people across the world to build the same sacred spaces, guided by knowledge that predates writing, that moves through channels deeper than language. They were called the threshold keepers. Though this name itself is modern, imposed by those who came after, trying to give a name to something that refused to be named. The keepers left no texts, no manifestos, no declarations of belief. They left only structures, only spaces, only the carefully arranged evidence of their presence, scattered like whispers across the face of the earth. Whispers tell us that archaeologists, in the 19th and 20th centuries, began discovering something that should have been impossible. In a mountain valley in Peru, in a forest clearing in Central Europe, in a remote plateau in Asia, in an island in the Mediterranean. Again and again chambers, ceremonial spaces, each one built with such precision that it matched its distant siblings in ways that defied explanation. The same proportions, the same orientation to cardinal points, the same mathematical relationships between interior dimensions, the same symbols, rendered in local materials, yet unmistakably aligned with the same cosmology. And yet, there was no evidence of trade, no roads connecting these sites, no artifacts of communication, no conquest or colonization that would explain how such synchronicity could occur. These communities existed in isolation, separated by vast distances and, in some cases, by centuries of time. And yet, they built as if guided by a shared blueprint, as if responding to the same call. The profound mystery deepens when one enters these chambers and truly listens. Each space was designed with acoustic properties of such precision that modern sound engineers struggle to comprehend how they were achieved without electronic measurement. In one chamber in Ireland, a sound made at a precise frequency in the eastern wall will resonate through the interior and emerge from the western wall in a state of perfect harmonic amplification. In another, located thousands of miles away in the mountains of Central Asia, the same phenomenon occurs at different frequency, calibrated to the specific dimensions of that space, yet demonstrating the same principle of intentional resonance. It is as if the threshold keepers understood that certain sounds, when positioned within certain geometric forms, could induce particular states of consciousness, that a human voice, or a drumbeat, or the sound of wind moving through stone channels, could be a tool not for communication, but for transformation, for opening doorways that exist not in space, but in the landscape of the mind. And the stars. The stars are everywhere in these spaces. Some believe that the threshold keepers possessed an astronomical knowledge so sophisticated that it seems impossible they could have developed it through observation alone. Each chamber is aligned not merely to the cardinal directions, but to celestial events that are invisible to the naked eye. The positions of planets in their orbital patterns, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, a cycle that takes thousands of years to complete. The precession of equinoxes, a cosmic dance so vast that it requires millennia to perceive its movement. Yet the chambers were built with such precision that they mark these events with mathematical exactitude. Consider the implications. Consider what it would mean if a civilization without telescopes, without written mathematics as we understand it, possessed knowledge of the cosmos so complete that they could engineer buildings to measure time on scales that span millennia. Either they received this knowledge from somewhere else, or they possessed methods of understanding reality, forms of consciousness, perhaps, or spiritual practices that allowed them to perceive what we think requires instruments. Beneath the silence, the deeper question emerges. What were these spaces for? The evidence suggests that the threshold keepers were not merely recording astronomical events. They were creating chambers designed to be entered, inhabited, experienced. Each space seems to have been calibrated for a specific human consciousness state. A chamber in Turkey, when inhabited during particular celestial alignments, produces acoustic frequencies that neuroscience now recognizes as inducing deep meditative states. The brainwaves of a practitioner entering these chambers begin to synchronize with the harmonic frequencies of the space itself. It is as if the chamber was designed as a tool to guide consciousness toward specific destinations. Were they maps? Were the threshold keepers creating a global network of consciousness technologies, strategically positioned to allow experienced practitioners to move between states of awareness that most humans never access? Were they creating bridges between worlds, between dimensions of reality that exist adjacently to ordinary perception? Or, and this is perhaps the most haunting possibility, were they receiving knowledge that required architectural expression? Were they encountering intelligences, or experiencing visions, or accessing forms of knowing that could not be transmitted through words or symbols, but only through direct experience? Through walking into a chamber and allowing the geometry, the silence, the acoustics, and the astronomical alignment to speak to something wordless within the deepest layers of consciousness. The threshold keepers left no words. This is crucial to understand. In a world where every other ancient civilization seems driven to carve their stories into stone, to proclaim their existence, to ensure that their names would be remembered, the threshold keepers chose silence. They chose to leave only the spaces themselves, only the chambers, only the mystery. Perhaps they understood something that we are still struggling to grasp, that the most profound knowledge cannot be spoken, that consciousness cannot be transferred through language, but only through direct encounter. That if you wanted to teach someone something about the nature of reality, about the possibilities of human awareness, about the existence of thresholds between states of being, you would not write about it. You would build a chamber. You would position it beneath the stars. You would calibrate its acoustic properties with such precision that when a person stood in that space, at a particular moment in the cosmic cycle, something within them would shift, would wake, would recognize itself. The threshold keepers scattered themselves across the world, not to establish an empire or proclaim dominion, but to seed the earth with these sacred spaces, to create a global network of gateways, to ensure that no matter where a seeker found themselves, there would be a threshold nearby, a chamber, a place where the boundaries between states of consciousness grew thin, where the veil that ordinarily separates us from larger realities could be gently parted. And then they vanished. Or perhaps they did not vanish, but simply stepped back. withdrew their presence from the surface of history, allowed their chambers to be reclaimed by earth and stone and time, allowed the knowledge they carried to disperse, to be forgotten, to become legend and myth, and the half-remembered dreams of peoples who built new civilizations on top of the old. We are only now beginning to find them again, only now beginning to understand what the threshold keepers knew, that the earth itself is alive with possibility, that consciousness can be shaped by geometry and sound and celestial alignment, that there exist doorways, and that some ancient people knew exactly where to place them. Perhaps, whispers the darkness, they are still there. The chambers still stand, still aligned to their celestial events, still waiting. And perhaps, if you were to enter one at exactly the right moment, when the stars are in their ancient positions, when the acoustic frequencies resonate through the stone, perhaps you would encounter what the threshold keepers themselves encountered. Perhaps you would cross the threshold they guarded so carefully, for so long, across such vast distances. Perhaps you would remember something that was never really forgotten, only silenced, only waiting for the right ear to listen. The map beneath the map. Cartography of the forgotten routes. Those who wonder what geography conceals in a monastery nestled in the Carpathian Mountains, where silence pulls in the stone corridors like water, there exists a moment captured in illuminated manuscript, a scribe's hand, medieval, precise, carefully, deliberately, methodically erasing something that an earlier hand had drawn. The motion is not hasty, not frantic. It is the work of someone following instruction, someone understanding the necessity of what is being unmade. The parchment beneath the brush shows the traces of older cartography, lines of trade routes, markings of distant lands, a world map that contradicts everything the medieval scholars believed the ancients knew. The scribe's hand moves. The world beneath vanishes. This is where the mystery begins. Not with discovery, but with erasure. Not with what we find, but with evidence of what was deliberately removed. It is said that palimpsest parchments scraped clean and written over again are the truest archives of suppressed knowledge, because no erasure is ever complete. The ghost of what came before bleeds through. The truth beneath persists, faint but legible to those with eyes patient enough to see. In the year 1923, a scholar's lamp illuminated such a palimpsest. Carefully, with techniques that would not damage the ancient parchment, researchers began to recover what had been hidden, and what they found was 3 worlds, 3 different maps, 3 versions of human geography. Whispers tell us that the uppermost layer showed the medieval world, Europe, parts of Asia, Africa, as understood through the fragmented knowledge of the Dark Ages. Inaccurate, incomplete, confident in its ignorance. This was the world that the monks of the monastery knew. This was what they believed to be true. Beneath it lay a second map, older, Byzantine, perhaps, or Roman. This layer showed greater sophistication, more accurate coastlines, more detailed trade routes, a world that was more thoroughly explored. This was the map of the classical world, the geography of empires, more extensive than medieval knowledge, yet still incomplete. But beneath these 2 maps and the layers that required the most delicate work to reveal lay a third cartography. And this is where the mystery deepens into something that contradicts historical certainty. The oldest map showed something impossible. It showed a global network of trade routes. It showed connections between continents that should have been isolated from one another. It showed pathways of commerce and knowledge spanning distances that conventional scholarship insists were not traversable with ancient technology. The map showed civilization not as scattered islands of development, but as an interconnected web, a world that knew itself, a humanity that was profoundly, mysteriously, impossibly connected. The evidence began to surface as the cartography was reconstructed. Amber from the Baltic appeared in tombs along the Mediterranean coast, not in quantities that suggest rare trade, but in abundance that implies regular commerce. Silk from the distant east, from regions that the Silk Road would not officially connect for thousands of years, appeared in Egyptian burial sites, in Mesopotamian temples, in Greek sanctuaries, not as curiosities, but as known materials, worked into the fabric of everyday life, astronomical knowledge. This was perhaps the most haunting evidence. Civilizations separated by vast oceans and continents possessed the same understanding of the stars, the same constellations, the same mathematical systems for measuring celestial movement, the same knowledge of precession, that vast cosmic wobble that takes millennia to perceive. How could isolated peoples, without means of communication, develop the same astronomical understanding? Unless they were not isolated, unless they were part of a network, unless the knowledge was shared. It is said that the researchers who studied this lost map began to ask a question that science could barely articulate. How was this possible? Two explanations emerged, each more extraordinary than the other. The first suggested that ancient peoples possessed technologies we have underestimated, that boats capable of long-distance ocean navigation existed in epochs we believed were purely coastal, that they possessed instrument stars, maps, perhaps, or mathematical tools that allowed them to traverse oceans with precision we do not typically associate with the ancient world, that perhaps the sophistication of ancient engineering was far greater than our fragmented historical record suggests. The second explanation was more mysterious, more subtle, perhaps more true, that ancient peoples possessed knowledge of how to navigate that transcended the need for technology as we understand it. Knowledge of star paths, the ability to read the night sky as a map of currents and coordinates. Knowledge of ocean swells and their patterns, which move invisibly beneath the surface yet remain constant across vast distances. Knowledge of winds and their seasons. Knowledge that existed in memory, in oral tradition, in the accumulated experience of sailors who had learned to read the earth and sky as a seamless text. Beneath the silence, the realization unfolds. These ancient peoples were not primitive. They were not isolated. They were not slowly, laboriously developing civilization in separate pockets of the world. They were connected. They were trading. They were sharing knowledge. They were maintaining relationships across distances that should have been impassable. And somewhere, at some point, someone decided that this knowledge was too destabilizing to preserve. The medieval monks, carefully erasing the older map, were not acting out of ignorance. They were acting out of intention, out of understanding, perhaps, that a world map showing global connection and ancient sophistication contradicted the theological certainties they were charged with maintaining. A world where isolated peoples slowly developed civilization made theological sense. A world where ancient peoples already knew how to navigate globally. That raised questions that the medieval church preferred not to ask. Some believe that the erasure was not specific to this one map, that across monasteries and centers of learning throughout the medieval world, similar suppressions occurred. Similar maps were painted over. Similar knowledge was deliberately obscured. A great forgetting engineered not by accident, but by intention. A narrowing of what was permitted to be known about human history. A boundary drawn between the possible and the impossible. The emotional arc is one of profound melancholy mixed with creeping wonder, because as we contemplate this lost world, this ancient, interconnected humanity that somehow possessed knowledge of global geography and long-distance trade, we are forced to confront a terrible, beautiful realization. We lost something precious, a sense of human unity, a knowledge that civilizations could be profoundly connected without conquest, a commerce that seemed to be based on mutual benefit rather than domination, a world where humanity knew itself. And somewhere, the ancients understood something that we have struggled to recover. They understood that knowledge of this global connection was powerful, potentially too powerful. Perhaps they feared that if humanity knew how connected it was across time, across distance, it would change something fundamental. It would make certain illusions untenable. It would undermine the boundaries and separations that allow empires to form and wars to be justified. So they erased it. Or more precisely, they erased the evidence of it, allowing the knowledge to fragment, to scatter, to become legend and myth, and the half-remembered dreams of peoples who no longer knew how to read the maps their ancestors had left. Consider what the medieval scribe was erasing. Not a false map, but a true one. A map that showed what the ancients knew. A cartography of connection. A vision of humanity as an integrated whole. And we can only imagine the weight of that, erasing the consciousness that some knowledge, once known, transforms forever how you understand your place in the world. Perhaps the fear was not that humanity would be harmed by knowing, Perhaps the fear was that humanity would be liberated by it, that if people understood how deeply connected the ancient world was, they might begin to question the present boundaries. They might begin to imagine a different kind of unity. They might begin to dream of restoration. And so the map was erased, layer upon layer, the truth buried beneath new certainties, the ancient world forgotten in favor of a simplified history that made sense to those in power. Yet the ghost remains, in the faint lines visible beneath the parchment, in the amber that should not exist in Mediterranean tombs, in the silk in Egyptian temples, in the shared astronomical knowledge, in the questions that will not be silenced. Perhaps, whispers the darkness, the map is still there, still waiting, still telling the story of how connected we were, of how much we knew, of how much we chose to forget. And perhaps, if we are patient enough, if we listen closely enough to the whispers beneath the silence, the ancient geography will speak to us again, will show us the roots that were always there, the connections that were never truly severed, the truth that lies beneath, waiting, always waiting, for eyes patient enough to see. The temple in the spiral, architecture that defies origin. Those who wonder what the ancients knew. High in an Andean valley, where mist clings to stone like a secret kept for centuries, there exists a structure that should not exist. It is built in a spiral, perfect, descending, or ascending. The perspective shifts depending on how you approach it, depending on the angle of light, depending on the state of your consciousness as you walk its geometric pathways. The stones fit together with such precision that no mortar was needed, no tool marks remain. The surface is smooth, almost polished, as if shaped by something other than hammer and chisel. And embedded within its geometry is mathematics, astronomy, a calendar that speaks of cycles so vast they spend millennia yet unborn. Who designed this? The question hangs in the thin mountain air like the mist itself, not as a practical inquiry, not as an archaeological puzzle to be solved through conventional means, but as something deeper, something that asks not merely how it was built, but why, and more profoundly, by whom, and for what purpose did they reach so far into the future? It is said that this temple was not built to shelter worshippers, not to honor gods in the way that temples ordinarily do. Instead, it was built as a marker, a signal, a way of speaking across time itself, a voice that has been calling to us for thousands of years, asking us questions we are only now beginning to formulate clearly enough to hear. Whispers tell us that the structure aligns simultaneously with three celestial phenomena. The first is the solar solstice, the moment each year when the sun reaches its furthest point in the sky, marking the turning of the seasons. The temple's spiral catches this light at a precise moment each year, illuminating a particular chamber deep within the structure, a chamber that bears inscriptions in a script that has never been successfully translated. The second alignment is with lunar phases. The full moon, at certain times of the year, casts shadows through the spiral's apertures that form patterns on the interior walls, patterns that appear to be intentional, designed, meaningful. The third alignment is the most troubling to scholars. The temple points toward a constellation that would have been visible from that location at a specific point in the Earth's distant past. Yet the constellation will not return to that position for another 10,000 years, as if the builders knew the vast cycles of precession, as if they were building not for their time, but for an age so distant that it dwells in futurity, in possibility, in a tomorrow that they would never see. Some believe that this precision speaks to knowledge that the ancients should not have possessed. The calculations required to account for precession, that slow wobble in the Earth's axis that takes 26,000 years to complete, require mathematics and astronomical observation that we associate with the modern era. Yet the temple stands, built in stone, built with hands, built by people who had not invented telescopes or computers or the mathematical notation we use today. And yet they knew. Somehow, they knew. The spiritual and mathematical sophistication required to conceive such a structure is almost incomprehensible. Imagine standing in that Andean valley, thousands of years ago. Imagine possessing such a deep understanding of the cosmos that you could look at the sky and perceive not merely what is visible tonight, or this year, or in this lifetime, but what will be visible 10,000 years hence. Imagine having such faith in this knowledge that you would dedicate your life, perhaps generations of lives, to building a temple that would stand as testimony to this vision. That would be a beacon that would speak across the vast stretches of time to a future humanity, saying, "We knew. We understood the cycles. We understood time itself." The exploration deepens as we consider what kind of knowledge system could produce such certainty. Modern astronomers can calculate the precession of equinoxes through mathematical models. But the ancients did not have mathematics as we understand it. So how did they know? Did they possess inner technologies of vision that we have lost? Did they develop forms of consciousness that allowed direct perception of vast temporal cycles? Did they receive this knowledge from somewhere else, from other cultures, from beings not human, from dimensions of reality we no longer have access to? Or perhaps, and this possibility whispers at the edges of our understanding, perhaps they possessed something that was more powerful than our technologies. Perhaps they had access to knowledge that existed outside of time itself. Knowledge that could be perceived not through calculation, but through direct knowing, through meditation, through spiritual practice, through the development of consciousness to such refined states that the secrets of the cosmos became transparent. Beneath the silence, another realization emerges. This temple was not built for the people of its time. It could not have been. The precision is too exact. The alignments too perfectly calculated. The message too clearly addressed to a future that the builders could not themselves enter. This was a gift, a communication, a way of saying to us, across the vast gulf of time, "We were here. We understood. We are leaving you a message in stone. When you are ready to read it, you will know that you are not the first to reach for knowledge of the cosmos. You are not the first to wonder about time and cycles and the structure of reality. We wondered too, and we left you this testimony." The temple stands as both practical structure and poetic utterance. It is a building, yes, but it is also a song, a prayer, a mathematical equation carved in stone, a voice that refuses to be silenced by time itself. Consider the emotional weight of this realization. Imagine the moment when an archaeologist, studying the precise measurements of the temple, suddenly understands that it aligns with the constellation that will not return for 10,000 years. What is that moment like? It is not the excitement of discovery, though there is that. It is something deeper. It is the tender ache of connection across time. It is the realization that we are not alone in wondering, that previous people stood where we stand and asked the same questions we ask, that they reached toward knowledge and sophistication with a dedication so profound that they built temples to communicate their understanding to a future they would never see. This is what makes the temple so moving, not its astronomical precision, not its architectural sophistication, but its intention, its reaching across time, its voice calling to us from the ancient past, asking us, "Are you yet ready to understand? Are you yet ready to know what we knew? Are you yet ready to perceive the cycles that govern reality?" The final reflection settles into the deepest mystery of all. This temple is not merely a structure. It is communication. It is a form of language made manifest in stone and spiral and careful astronomical alignment. And the message it carries is simple, profound, and endlessly complex. The universe is not random. Time is not linear. Reality operates according to principles that can be known. And those who know these principles can leave messages that will echo across millennia, waiting for the right ears to hear them. It is said that if you stand in the temple at the moment of the solstice, when the light penetrates to the innermost chamber, you will feel something shift within you. A recognition, a knowing, as if the ancients who built this place are speaking directly to your soul, saying, "This is what we understood. This is what we are leaving you." The knowledge that reality is far more complex, far more beautiful, far more meaningful than ordinary perception allows. Perhaps this temple was never meant to be found by accident. Perhaps it waits in that Andean valley, hidden by mist and vegetation, and the sheer audacity of its implausibility, for those who are ready to understand what it means. Those who have developed consciousness sophisticated enough to perceive that the ancients were not primitive. They were reaching, they were knowing, they were building messages that span the distance between civilizations separated by thousands of years of time. And perhaps, whispers the darkness as sleep approaches, They are still speaking, still reaching, still trying to tell us something about time, about cycles, about the very nature of what it means to be human in a cosmos that is far more orderly, far more intentional, far more communicative than we have allowed ourselves to believe. The temple spirals upward and inward, and somewhere in its geometry, a voice continues to call, waiting for us to finally learn how to listen. The silence between the stones, a monument to nothing. Those who understand that absence can be sacred imagine standing in the center of a circle of stones. The circle is perfect, formed by massive upright boulders, positioned with such mathematical precision that ancient surveyors using modern instruments would marvel at the accuracy. Each stone is separate from the next. There is no wall, no enclosure, no barrier. Yet you stand surrounded, enclosed not by physical matter, but by intention, by the careful arrangement of emptiness. And in that moment, as you turn slowly, feeling the weight of the stones around you, perceiving the space they create precisely by not filling it, something shifts within you. A presence, an arrival, a sudden, undeniable sense that this empty space is not vacant, that it is full, that it is alive. This is the mystery that whispers at the edge of our understanding. It is said that in northern Europe, in a landscape that is now moorland, rolling hills covered in heather and grass, mist clinging to the earth in the gray mornings, there stands a monument unlike any other. Archaeologists have named it the Empty Monument, for lack of a better phrase. The stones are there. The circle is undeniable. But what makes it extraordinary is not what it contains, but what it refuses to contain. The center remains empty, deliberately, intentionally, held sacred precisely through its vacancy. Whispers tell us that in the year 1500, a traveler whose name has been lost, whose purpose for traveling remains obscure, encountered this circle of stones. What he left behind was a journal entry, brief but haunting. He writes, "I stood within the ring of stones and felt a presence as profound as any cathedral I have ever entered. Yet there was nothing there, no altar, no idol, no reliquaries or sacred objects, only emptiness. Yet I could not shake the feeling that I was not alone, that the emptiness itself was a being, that I was in the presence of something vast and conscious and wholly other." The traveler's words hang in the silence of centuries. How can emptiness be a presence? How can nothing be something? Yet those who have stood where he stood report similar sensations. A fullness in the void, a substance to the absence, a consciousness that seems to inhabit the empty space itself. Some believe that this monument was built not to contain something physical, not to house a god or a king or the relics of the sacred dead. Rather, it was built to reserve space, to set aside a location on the earth and say, "This place is sacred precisely because nothing will be placed here." This circle exists not to display or to proclaim, but to open, to allow, to create a vessel for the intangible. Consider what kind of spiritual understanding would compel a people to undertake such work, to move massive stones, to arrange them with mathematical precision. To invest generations of effort for such a project could not have been completed quickly in creating a space whose purpose was to remain empty. What vision of the sacred would make emptiness itself precious? What understanding of power would make absence powerful? Beneath the silence, the exploration deepens. Various cultures throughout history have understood emptiness not as lack, but as presence. The Taoist concept of Wu non-being is understood as the fundamental source from which all being emerges. It is not nothing in the sense of absence. It is the pregnant void, the fertile silence from which all creation springs. The Chinese character itself suggests space that is full, ready, waiting. Buddhist philosophy similarly describes sunyata, often translated as emptiness, yet understood as the fundamental nature of reality, not as negation, but as openness, as the absence of fixed essence that allows all things to rise and transform. Indigenous peoples across the globe have long understood certain spaces, particular clearings in forests, specific vistas on mountains, certain chambers and caves as sacred precisely because they were left empty, not filled with structure or ornamentation, but preserved as gateways, as places where consciousness could gather, where visions could arise, where the boundary between the material and the immaterial grew thin? What if the builders of the empty monument understood something that modern minds struggle to grasp? What if they comprehended that the most powerful spaces are those that remain unadorned? That a circle of stones, by defining the boundaries of emptiness, creates a container for consciousness itself? That you can build a temple to nothing, and that nothing understood rightly is everything? It is said that the stones themselves may have been chosen with care, each one positioned to align with celestial events, or with landscape features, or with subtle earth currents that cultures of a different consciousness might have perceived. The circle may have been a tool, a device for gathering energy, a way of focusing the diffuse presence of the sacred, the immaterial, the ineffable, the spirit that moves through all things into a particular location, particular moment, a particular space. The emotional journey of understanding this monument is a journey into reverence. It begins with confusion. How can emptiness matter? How can nothing be sacred? But gradually, as you stand within the circle, as you allow yourself to feel the presence that the emptiness creates, confusion transforms into wonder, and wonder deepens into awe. Because you realize that this monument is expressing a profound truth. The greatest things we create are often not the things we build, but the things we choose to leave undone. The spaces we consecrate by refusing to fill them. The possibilities we hold open by refusing to foreclose them. Consider how different this is from the impulse that drives most human creation. We build monuments to proclaim, to display, to say I was here, or we were great, or this is eternal. We fill spaces with meaning. We inscribe our intentions into matter. But the builders of the empty monument did something radically different. They built in order to receive. They created a structure whose entire purpose was to remain open, to wait, to hold space for experiences and visions and consciousness states that could not be named or predicted or controlled. This is perhaps the deepest spiritual sophistication, the understanding that some things cannot be captured, that some knowledge can only be encountered, that some truths can only be experienced in the presence of emptiness, that if you want to teach someone about the infinite, you do not fill the space with symbols or words. You leave it empty. You create a container for infinity. You build a monument to the void. The final reflection settles us into that imagined standing within the circle. Feel the presence of the stones around you. Ancient, patient, silent. The center is empty, yet not empty. It holds something that cannot be named. It contains something that transcends the physical. If you were to close your eyes and stand very still, you might perceive what the 1500-year-old traveler perceived. A presence, a consciousness, a sense of being held within something vast and alive. The circle does not demand that you believe anything. It does not require faith in a particular doctrine. It simply asks that you open yourself to the possibility that emptiness can be sacred, that absence can be profound, that the spaces we leave undone may speak louder than the things we build. Perhaps the greatest monuments are not those that proclaim loudest, but those that listen deepest. Not those that fill every space with meaning, but those that reserve space for meaning to arise. Not those that demand attention through their grandeur, but those that whisper to us through their silence. And perhaps, as sleep begins to draw near, somewhere on a misty moorland in the north, the circle still stands, still empty, still waiting, still holding space for the consciousness of all who come to stand within it, still teaching, without words, that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is to build nothing at all, to leave a space open, to consecrate the void. The silence between the stones continues to speak. To those who have learned to listen, to those who understand that emptiness, rightly perceived, is infinitely full. The objects without purpose, a museum of the inexplicable, those who wonder what we cannot understand in a basement that few people know exists. Beneath the polished floors and the curated exhibitions of a small archaeological museum in Central Europe, there rests a collection, not on display, not in the formal arrangement of a public space, meant to educate or impress, but in a basement, in storage, in the careful keeping of items that museums are unsure how to present, how to explain, how to fit into the narratives that history has agreed upon. The curator's hand trembles slightly as she unlocks the cabinet. Within lies a stone sphere, perfectly round, the size of a human head, perhaps slightly smaller, and inside this stone sphere, visible through minute fissures in its surface, are internal chambers, delicate, precisely carved, accessible to no one. Because there is no opening, the sphere is sealed, complete, purposeless. What was it for? The question hangs in the basement air like dust motes caught in the single beam of light permitted from the high window. And beneath that question lies another, deeper one. What kind of civilization expends such effort, such skill, such resources, such time to create something that serves no function? It is said that this basement collection has been growing for nearly 2 centuries. Archaeologists, encountering objects they could not classify, brought them here, added them to the collection, each artifact arriving with a question mark, each one bearing evidence of intentionality, precision, sophistication, the unmistakable mark of human skill and purpose, yet bearing no clue as to what that purpose might have been. Whispers tell us of a copper vessel with pipes leading to chambers deep within its structure, yet the pipes appear to serve no practical function. Water would not flow through them. Heat would not travel them. They lead nowhere. They open into spaces that connect to nothing. Yet the metalwork is exquisite. The engineering is sophisticated. The vessel was clearly created with intention, with knowledge, with purpose. Yet its purpose remains locked within the metal itself. There is a clay tablet, medieval, perhaps, or much older. The dating is uncertain. It bears mathematical equations rendered in precise notation, equations that should not exist, calculations that require knowledge of geometry, of proportion, of mathematical principles that would not be discovered or formally developed for centuries after the tablet was made. Yet there it is, stone, permanent, mathematical, inexplicable. Some believe that these objects were not designed for physical use at all. That to ask, what was it for, is to ask the wrong question entirely. Perhaps these objects were designed for the mind, for consciousness. Perhaps they were models, 3-dimensional representations of concepts too abstract to be expressed in words or even in 2-dimensional art. Perhaps a sphere with internal chambers was a way of depicting something about the nature of the soul, or consciousness, or the hidden structures of reality itself. Perhaps they were teaching tools, knowledge objects, sacred geometry rendered in matter as a way of transmitting wisdom that could not be spoken. The shape itself, the proportions, the mathematical relationships would teach, would instruct, would guide the consciousness of whoever held it toward particular understandings. And once that teaching was accomplished, once the knowledge had been transmitted, the object's purpose would be fulfilled. Its continued physical function would be irrelevant. Beneath the silence, the exploration deepens into something more troubling and more beautiful. The objects in this basement collection span thousands of years. They emerge from dozens of cultures separated by vast distances and centuries of time. And yet, they share a common characteristic. None of them appear to have served any practical function. None of them fit into the ordinary categories: tools, weapons, vessels, religious objects with clear ceremonial purpose. They stand apart, inexplicable, united only by their inexplicability. This synchronicity itself is remarkable. Radically different cultures, with no evidence of contact or communication, created objects that served no apparent purpose. How could this be? Did they all stumble upon the same kind of impulse? The same desire to create objects without practical function? Or were they responding to something deeper, a human need to create objects that transcended the purely practical, that spoke to something beyond survival, beyond ritual, beyond the ordinary categories of material life? The deep investigation ventures into the possibility that the gap between the creators of these objects and modern observers is simply too vast, that these objects were perfectly comprehensible and meaningful to their makers, that each one was created with clear purpose, with full understanding of what it was meant to do. But that purpose was encoded in a language of symbols, of sacred geometry, of spiritual knowledge, of mathematical principles understood through different frameworks that did not survive. The knowledge system that gave these objects meaning was lost. The civilization that created them vanished or transformed into something else. And the objects remained, mute testimony to a sophistication and a kind of understanding that we can no longer access. Consider the emotional weight of standing before such objects. At first, there is confusion, frustration, even. Why would someone spend such effort creating something that serves no purpose? Why would multiple cultures across centuries do the same thing? The confusion gradually transforms into wonder, because you begin to realize that perhaps the very idea of purpose that guides modern thinking is too narrow. Perhaps there are kinds of purpose that transcend the practical. Perhaps there is purpose in beauty that has no function. Purpose in objects that teach through their existence rather than through their use. Purpose in creating something that asks questions rather than providing answers. And gradually, that wonder deepens into something like humility. Because standing before these objects, you are forced to confront a profound truth. We may be surrounded by evidence of sophisticated understanding, and yet remain unable to read it. The objects are here. They speak. They testify. They whisper across the millennia. But we lack the capacity to understand their language. We have lost the framework that would make their purpose clear. It is said that if you spend enough time with these objects, truly spending time, not merely observing them, but allowing your consciousness to settle into their presence, something shifts. You begin to perceive them not as failures of clarity, but as successful transmissions of knowledge that transcends language. The sphere with internal chambers begins to suggest something about the nature of consciousness. The vessel with pipes leading nowhere begins to whisper about flows of energy that move through invisible channels. The tablet with impossible equations begins to hint at mathematical relationships that our modern understanding has not yet recovered. These objects are not failures. They are not primitive misunderstandings. They are precise expressions of knowledge systems that operated according to principles we no longer employ. They are voices calling to us from a distance so vast that we struggle to hear them. They are reminders that human sophistication and human understanding take many forms. That there are ways of knowing that do not express themselves through words or through the technologies we have learned to value. That there are purposes for creating objects that have nothing to do with practical function, yet everything to do with the transmission of truth. The final reflection settles into reverent uncertainty. These objects are not mysteries because they are poorly made or poorly understood. They are mysteries because they were made by people who understood something we have forgotten, who possessed frameworks of knowledge, spiritual, mathematical, philosophical, that allowed them to create objects whose purpose was not to be used, but to be encountered, to be experienced, to speak directly to the consciousness of those who came into contact with them. They ask us a question that echoes through the basement where they rest, through the museum that houses them, through the centuries that separate us from their makers. What if we have been asking the wrong questions all along? What if purpose is not about function? What if sophistication is not about technological achievement? What if the most important knowledge is not knowledge that can be spoken, but knowledge that must be encountered directly, through the presence of objects that exist precisely to remind us of what we have forgotten? Perhaps these objects will never be fully understood. Perhaps their meaning died with their makers, and no amount of study or speculation will recover it. But there is a strange grace in that possibility, because it means that some knowledge is preserved not by being transmitted, but by remaining beyond our reach. Some truths are protected by remaining inexplicable. Some wisdom endures precisely by remaining mysterious. And so, the sphere sits in the basement vault, perfectly round, perfectly sealed, perfectly purposeless in every way except the way that matters most. It waits. It whispers. It asks us to expand our understanding of what objects can mean, what purposes can be, what kinds of knowledge deserve to be preserved in stone and metal and clay. Perhaps, whispers the darkness, these objects are not meant to be solved. They are meant to be reverenced. They are meant to remind us of the humility we ought to feel before the sophistication of those who came before. They are meant to teach us that the world contains more mysteries than our current frameworks allow, and that, in the end, is a kind of purpose too. The city that sank into morning light, those who wonder what it means to choose to disappear in the archives of a library, not the famous ones, but a smaller repository in a Mediterranean port town. There exists a fragment, a page, aged to the color of honey, bearing script that shifts between languages, Greek and something else, something that resembles no written tongue we can easily identify. The text describes a morning, dawn breaking over water. Citizens of a city whose name appears to have been carefully erased from the margin, deliberately removed, walking toward the sea, carrying torches, singing. The manuscript says, "They sang in a language that was not quite language, and as the sun rose above the horizon, the city and its people became light itself. Whether they drowned or transformed, we who remained could not say. We only knew that what had been no longer was, and we mourned not a loss, but a departure." The manuscript ends there. It is said that legends from a dozen Mediterranean cultures describe a city that should not have existed, not because it was implausible, but because it was too perfect, too harmonious, too impossible in its synthesis. They called it the bridge between worlds. This city built on a peninsula that jutted into the sea like an offering. And yet, no ruins have ever been conclusively identified. No archaeological site has ever been formally designated as the location of this legendary place. It exists only in fragments, in whispers, in manuscripts that describe it with such clarity and specificity that scholars cannot quite bring themselves to dismiss the accounts as pure myth, yet cannot quite affirm them as historical fact. Whispers tell us that this city was neither Greek nor Roman in character. It was not Phoenician, though Phoenician traders knew its harbors. It was not Egyptian, though Egyptian philosophers studied in its libraries. Instead, it synthesized something from all of them and transcended them all. The architecture bore influences from multiple cultures, yet maintained its own distinctive aesthetic, a style that was neither derivative nor imitative, but original. The art that emerged from the city seemed to speak a language that other cultures recognized as wise, as profound, as touching something fundamental about the nature of beauty and meaning. The philosophy that developed within its walls concerned itself not with the ordinary problems of metaphysics or ethics, but with something deeper, the nature of consciousness itself, the relationship between being and becoming, the possibilities of human transformation. Some believe that the city was built by people who possessed a knowledge that other cultures sensed but could not quite grasp. A knowledge about the nature of consciousness, about spiritual practice, about the possibility of humanity evolving into states of being that transcended the ordinary categories of existence. The city itself was an expression of this knowledge, its architecture, its art, its entire way of organizing social life, all designed to facilitate a particular kind of spiritual development. The exploration deepens as we consider the evidence of the city's existence and its final disappearance. Multiple ancient texts reference it. Historians from various cultures mention it. Traders from known Mediterranean civilizations describe having visited its harbors. The references are consistent enough that they cannot all be coincidence or fabrication. Yet the city itself has vanished. No substantial ruins, no archaeological layers, no definitive location. It is as if the city withdrew not only from space, but from history itself. Beneath the silence, a more profound question emerges: what actually happened on that final dawn? The manuscripts that describe the departure are remarkably consistent, despite being written in different languages and from the perspective of outsiders who observed only fragments. The citizens did not flee in panic. There was no invasion, no natural catastrophe, no plague driving them away. Instead, they walked, deliberately, organized, ceremonial. The accounts suggest that this was a planned departure, a choice made consciously, collectively, with full awareness of what was being surrendered. They walked into the sea at sunrise carrying torches, singing, and whether they drowned or whether something else happened, whether they transformed into some other form of existence, whether they ascended into dimensions beyond ordinary perception, whether they simply vanished, the accounts do not clarify. They only insist that what occurred was neither tragedy nor accident. It was intention. The emotional weight of this narrative is profound. We are confronted with the question that modern consciousness struggles to hold. What if a civilization chose to end itself, not through destruction, but through deliberate transformation? What if a people, having reached a particular point of spiritual development, a particular understanding, a particular level of consciousness, decided that continuing to exist in the physical world was no longer necessary or desirable. What if they chose to dissolve, to transform, to move into some other state of being? This possibility troubles us. We are accustomed to thinking of civilizations as trying to endure, to expand, to leave monuments, to ensure their survival and memory. We understand destruction. We understand gradual decline and transformation into something else. But deliberate, collective, ceremonial disappearance, that is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. It is said that those who came after the cultures that knew of the city, that had contact with it, that mourned its departure struggled with the same incomprehension. Yet their accounts are striking in their tone. There is sadness, yes, loss, but beneath the sadness lies something else, a sense that what occurred was somehow necessary, right, a movement toward something greater rather than a descent into oblivion. One medieval text, preserved in fragmentary form, contains a passage that speaks to this. The city departed as the sun rises, not in darkness, not in struggle, but in the light of transformation. And we who remained understood, finally, that true wisdom is knowing when to cease being in order to become something greater. The city sank not into the sea, but into morning itself. And perhaps that is where all beautiful things must go, into the light, beyond the reach of time. The deep investigation ventures into territory where history and mythology merge. Was this city a historical reality? A place that actually existed, that people actually inhabited, that actually vanished on a particular day at a particular moment? Or was it a mythological creation, a story designed to communicate a spiritual truth? A teaching presented as history? A narrative meant to encode knowledge about consciousness, transformation, and the nature of human possibility? Perhaps the question itself is misguided. Perhaps the city was both historical and mythological, real and symbolic, a place that existed in the material world and simultaneously existed as a teaching, as a symbol, as a story designed to transmit wisdom to those who heard it. Consider what such a narrative communicates. If a city sank into light, if a people chose transformation over survival, if an entire civilization let go of physical existence in order to become something else, what does that teach us? It teaches that consciousness can be more important than matter, that transformation can be more beautiful than permanence, that wisdom might sometimes look like loss from the perspective of those who remain behind. The final reflection settles into meditation on the nature of impermanence and choice. The city, whether it was literal or symbolic or both, represents something that modern civilization has largely forgotten. The possibility that choosing to end is sometimes a form of wisdom. Not death, in the sense of tragedy, but transformation, evolution, a movement into a state that transcends physical existence. Perhaps the city did not vanish because it was destroyed. Perhaps it vanished because it graduated, because it achieved what it was meant to achieve, and then consciously released its hold on physical form, because the people who inhabited it understood something about consciousness, about time, about the relationship between being and becoming, that allowed them to make this choice. And perhaps the reason we still speak of it, the reason legends persist, the reason manuscripts preserve the story, the reason the image of citizens walking into the morning light singing in a language that is not quite language continues to haunt us, is because the story itself is a form of resurrection. The city sank not beneath the waves, but beneath time. It became legend, and in becoming legend, it achieved a kind of permanence that stone cannot hold. Its truth lives not in archaeological layers, but in the hearts and minds of those who hear the story and feel something stir within them, a recognition, an understanding, a sense that what we are looking at is not merely narrative, but teaching. And so, as sleep begins to approach, we contemplate a city that sank into morning light. We imagine citizens walking into the sea, carrying torches, singing. We wonder whether they drowned or transformed, whether they disappeared or transcended. And in that wondering, we find ourselves touching something sacred, something about the nature of consciousness, about the possibility of chosen transformation, about the power of story to preserve what time cannot. Perhaps the city is still there, not in the Mediterranean, but in the realm of story, in the space between history and myth, still existing, still singing, still reaching out to those who are ready to understand what it means to choose light over stone, still waiting for us to be brave enough to imagine its truth. The language written in starlight, an alphabet of the cosmos. Those who wonder what the stars were always trying to say. Imagine standing in a high valley, where the air is thin and the night sky seems to press down with a weight that is almost tangible. The rock faces around you are carved deliberately, precisely with symbols, not inscriptions in the conventional sense, not words that can be traced with the fingertip and read by candlelight. Rather, symbols positioned with such exactness that they point toward particular stars at particular moments in the year. And as you stand there, turning slowly, aligning your eyes with the carved marks and the heavens above, you begin to understand something that transforms everything. The symbols are reading the stars, or the stars are reading the symbols. Or perhaps, and this possibility whispers most insistently, there is no difference between reading and being read. The ancient people who carved these marks understood something about writing that we have forgotten. They understood that writing is not merely marks on surfaces. It is said that in a high valley in what is now Tibet, there exists a series of symbols carved into rock faces that have never been satisfactorily explained by conventional archaeology. They match no known written language. They align with no established system of notation. And yet, they are clearly intentional, clearly the work of minds that understood geometry, that comprehended the movements of celestial bodies, that possessed knowledge of astronomical cycles so sophisticated that modern scholars struggle to explain how such knowledge could have been acquired without telescopes, without written mathematics, without the technological apparatus we assume is necessary for such understanding. Whispers tell us that these symbols were not designed to be read by eyes moving across stone in ordinary daylight. Instead, they were designed to be read through alignment with the stars themselves. Each symbol points toward a particular star at a particular time of year. The arrangement of symbols creates a pattern that mirrors the arrangement of constellations in the sky. The carvings function simultaneously as a calendar marking the turning of seasons through celestial events, as a map showing the positions and relationships of stars in the night sky, and as something else entirely, something that we might call an alphabet, a system of communication, a message carved not into the rock, but carved into the relationship between the rock and the cosmos. Some believe that these symbols represent the most sophisticated form of writing ever developed. Because they transcend the limitations of traditional written language, they cannot be damaged or destroyed by fire, by flood, by the ordinary decay that claims all paper and most stone carvings. They exist as long as the rocks stand and the stars move through their eternal patterns. They communicate not through arbitrary symbols whose meanings must be learned and remembered, but through direct correspondence. The meaning is embedded in the structure of the universe itself. To read these symbols is to read reality directly. Beneath the silence, the exploration deepens into something profound. Consider what it would mean to understand writing not as marks on surfaces, but as patterns in space and time. What if certain ancient peoples perceived that the entire cosmos was a kind of text? That the movement of stars, the cycles of seasons, the positions of mountains and valleys, the flow of water through the landscape, all of these were letters and words and sentences in a vast, cosmic language. Not a language that someone wrote, but a language that is. A language that consciousness itself speaks when it expresses itself through matter and motion. The symbols in the Tibetan Valley appear to be an attempt to make this cosmic language explicit, to translate the movements of stars into marks on stone, to create a bridge between human consciousness and the consciousness of the cosmos itself. Each symbol is positioned not randomly, but with such precision that it catches the light of specific stars at specific times. When a particular star rises at a particular moment, its light would have illuminated the corresponding symbol. The symbol and the star would have been aligned. And in that alignment, a communication would occur, not through sound, not through words, but through direct correspondence, through the meeting of human intention and cosmic movement. The emotional arc of encountering these symbols is one of progressive expansion. At first, there is confusion. How could ancient people without our technologies possess such astronomical knowledge? How could they create such precise works without modern instruments? But gradually, as you spend time with the symbols, as you study the alignments, as you allow your consciousness to settle into the pattern they create, something shifts. You begin to understand that perhaps these ancient peoples were not more primitive than we are. They were simply literate in a different language, a language that modern consciousness has largely forgotten how to read. They knew something about the cosmos that we have lost. They understood that the stars were not merely distant suns, but teachers, that the sky was not merely the backdrop for human affairs, but an active intelligence trying to communicate, that if you positioned yourself correctly, if you carved the right symbols, if you aligned your intention with the movements of celestial bodies, you could participate in a conversation with the universe itself. It is said that those who spend time reading these symbols report a profound sense of connection, not merely intellectual understanding, but a felt sense of being part of something vast, of consciousness recognizing itself across the gulf between the small human mind and the infinite cosmos. The symbols seem to whisper, "We are not separate. The language you speak with your mouth, we speak with our orbits and movements. The patterns you trace in stone, we trace across the void. We are always communicating. The question is only whether you have learned to listen." The deep investigation considers what we have lost in developing our modern systems of writing. We have gained precision, portability, the ability to communicate across distances. But we have lost something equally precious, the understanding that communication might occur through direct correspondence with reality itself. That writing might not be an arbitrary system of symbols pointing toward meanings that exist only in human consciousness, but a direct transcription of meaning already present in the structure of existence. What if the ancient peoples who carved these symbols understood that consciousness is not confined to individual human minds? What if they perceived that the cosmos itself is conscious, communicating endlessly through the movements of stars and planets, through the cycles of seasons, through the very geometry of space and time? And what if they created these symbols as a way of saying, "We hear you, we understand. We are translating your language into stone so that future generations might remember what you are saying"? The final reflection settles us into a state of cosmic wonder. Imagine standing in that high valley at night. The stars will overhead in their eternal patterns, and carved into the rocks around you, the ancient symbols catch their light. Each symbol aligning with its corresponding star, each one a word, each one a greeting, each one a piece of a vast conversation that has been occurring since the cosmos began. The ancients were not primitive. They were not ignorant of the stars. They were shamans of language itself. They understood that consciousness seeks to communicate and to preserve itself through whatever means are available. And they chose the most permanent, the most magnificent, the most cosmic means possible. They wrote not in ink or paint, but in the relationship between carved stone and distant stars. They created a writing system that would persist as long as the earth and sky remain. A language that future peoples could read if they learned to look upward, if they learned to align themselves with the movements of celestial bodies, if they learned to understand that the universe itself is always trying to speak. Perhaps, whispers the darkness as sleep approaches, the stars have always been writing to us, and we have only forgotten how to read their language. Perhaps if we looked upward long enough, if we learned to perceive the patterns, if we understood that communication occurs through alignment and correspondence, we would begin to hear what the cosmos has always been saying. And perhaps, the voice fades to the gentlest whisper, somewhere in a high valley where the air is thin and the night sky presses close. The ancient symbols are still glowing, still pointing, still reading, still waiting for us to remember that we were always meant to be part of this conversation. The language written in starlight, forever old, forever new, forever calling us home. The remains of song, an archive of lost music. Those who wonder what sound can teach in a concert hall in Vienna, on a winter evening when snow falls outside the windows and silence pools in the spaces between heartbeats, a musician sits before instruments that should not exist, reconstructed from fragments, reborn from dust and scholarly speculation. The instruments are arranged before him, clay vessels shaped in ways that suggest acoustic precision, stone pipes carved with such exactness that modern musicologists struggle to understand how they were made. He closes his eyes. He breathes. And then, hesitantly, he begins to play. What emerges is not quite music, and yet it is. The sounds are unfamiliar. They do not follow the harmonic progressions that Western ears have learned to expect. They do not resolve into the comfortable patterns of major or minor keys. Instead, they spiral. They echo. They seem to move in dimensions that sound ordinarily does not occupy. And as the musician plays, something shifts in the listening consciousness. Not pleasure, exactly. Not the kind of beauty that makes the heart soar. Rather, something deeper. A sense of profound alignment. A resonance with something fundamental. The feeling that these sounds are not merely vibrating the air, but vibrating something within the deepest structures of consciousness itself. The musician, when he finishes, sits in silence for a long moment. When he speaks, his voice is trembling. He says, "I felt less like I was playing music, and more like I was reading something, as if these sounds were a language, as if I was speaking truths that I had forgotten I knew." This is where the mystery begins. It is said that in the ruins of a city destroyed in antiquity, a city whose name has been lost, whose location remains uncertain, whose existence was known only through fragments of reference in later texts, archaeologists discovered something that should have been impossible, not merely evidence that ancient peoples made music. We have long known this. Ancient instruments survive. We have documented their sounds. But what was discovered in this ruined city transcended the ordinary evidence of musical practice. Whispers tell us that archaeologists uncovered an entire system, a notation, a way of encoding sound into permanent form. Clay tablets bearing symbols that appeared to represent musical information. Stone instruments carved with such precision that they suggested not merely the expression of musical impulse, but the systematic exploration of sound's possibilities. The notation system was complex, extraordinarily complex, far more developed than any contemporary culture system of musical notation. It included markings that appeared to indicate not merely the pitch and duration of notes, but something else entirely. Something that suggested emotional content, spiritual dimension, states of consciousness to be induced through sound. Some believe that what the archaeologists had discovered was not an archive of music in the sense that we understand it, not a collection of songs preserved for entertainment or religious ceremony, rather a system of recorded knowledge, a technology, a map of consciousness encoded in sound. Each composition appeared to have been designed not to express emotion, but to induce it, not to please the ear, but to transform the hearer, not to entertain, but to transport. Beneath the silence, the exploration deepens into the most profound question: what was this music for? The historical evidence offers tantalizing hints. Texts from later civilizations reference the songs of the ancients, with a tone of reverence mixed with something like fear. One Greek scholar, writing centuries after the city's destruction, describes melodies that were said to produce visions in those who heard them, sounds that seemed to open doorways in the mind, music that was less entertainment than medicine, less art than technology. The notation itself suggests the possibility of spiritual or healing applications. The symbols that accompanied melodic and rhythmic notation appeared to indicate particular emotional or spiritual states. There was a symbol that appeared repeatedly on tablets describing one composition, a symbol that matched symbols found in healing temples. Another symbol seemed to correlate with astronomical alignments, suggesting that the music might have been designed to be performed at particular celestial moments for enhanced effect. A third symbol appeared in conjunction with notes marked in patterns that modern neuroscience would recognize as similar to frequencies associated with deep meditation or trance states. It is said that modern musicians and researchers who have attempted to reconstruct these ancient compositions report consistent experiences. The music produces a state that is neither quite waking nor quite sleeping, a state of profound awareness combined with the sense of boundaries dissolving. Some describe encountering visions while hearing the music. Others speak of accessing memories they did not know they possessed. All of them speak of the experience as transformative, as if something essential within them had been reorganized, realigned, restored to a state of balance that they had not realized they had lost. The deep investigation considers whether ancient peoples possessed knowledge of sound as a practical tool for consciousness development. Modern science has documented the effects of specific frequencies on human physiology and psychology. Certain frequencies appear to induce alpha brainwaves associated with meditation. Others seem to facilitate the release of neurochemicals associated with healing and well-being. Still others produce what researchers call binaural beat effects, the brain's tendency to synchronize with complex rhythmic patterns, potentially facilitating altered states of consciousness. What if the ancients had discovered these principles through millennia of careful observation? What if they had developed a sophisticated understanding of how sound could be used not merely as art, but as a tool, a technology for healing, for spiritual development, for accessing states of consciousness that ordinarily remain beyond reach? What if the loss of this music represented not merely the loss of artistic expression, but the loss of a practical, systematic method for human transformation? The emotional arc is one of aching longing. To contemplate these lost songs, to imagine what it would be like to hear them, to feel the resonance they were designed to produce. There is a kind of grief in this contemplation, a mourning not for the beauty that was lost, but for the knowledge, for the possibility, for the human capacity that was surrendered when these melodies vanished. The final reflection settles into meditation on what the remains of song can teach us. These clay tablets and stone instruments are not merely artifacts. They are testimony to a civilization that understood something about the nature of consciousness, the power of sound, the possibility of using sound not as decoration or entertainment, but as transformation. They are voices reaching across the gulf of millennia saying, "We knew something. We discovered something. We encoded it into music, because music is the most durable form of knowledge, because melody travels where words cannot, because sound carries meaning that bypasses the rational mind and speaks directly to the deepest structures of consciousness." Perhaps these melodies were more than art. Perhaps they were maps of inner landscapes, pathways through consciousness that the ancients had charted with such precision that they could encode the roots in notation, could pass them forward to generations not yet born, could trust that someday, someone would reconstruct the maps and walk the pathways again. Perhaps the music was a technology so sophisticated that later civilizations, unable to understand it, abandoned it. And in abandoning it, we lost something precious. A tool, a teacher, a voice calling us toward states of being that we have forgotten how to access. And so, as sleep begins to draw near, we contemplate these remains of song. We imagine the sounds. We feel, in our bodies, the resonance they were designed to produce. We sense the presence of ancient musicians who understood something we have lost. And we listen as if the silence itself might contain echoes of the melodies, as if we listen deeply enough, we might hear them still, calling, reaching, guiding us toward home, toward the states of being we have forgotten, toward the music that was always trying to teach us. The Chamber of the Seven Metals, an alchemical impossibility. Those who wonder what knowledge waits in darkness beneath a fortified city in the Middle East, a city whose name appears in no official records, whose location has been deliberately obscured in modern archaeological reports, there exists a door. The door itself is unremarkable, stone, ancient, but the seal that holds it closed is extraordinary. Not a lock in the conventional sense, rather, a binding. A spiritual sealing, the kind of seal that suggests not merely the intention to preserve contents, but the intention to preserve them against time itself, against discovery, against the possibility that those contents might be accessed before humanity was ready to receive them. When archaeologists finally breached this seal carefully with reverence, with the sense that they were about to encounter something that had been waiting in darkness for over 2,000 years, what they found inside was more mysterious than anything they could have imagined. 7 vessels, each one a different metal. It is said that in that sealed chamber, arranged with mathematical precision on stone shelves carved with symbols in an unknown script, there stood 7 metallic vessels. The first was copper, oxidized green with age, its surface etched with markings that suggested purposeful design. The second was tin, pale and silver, bearing inscriptions in multiple languages, some recognized, others completely opaque. The third was iron, rust-colored, its form suggesting both utilitarian function and ceremonial significance. The fourth was gold, untarnished despite the millennia, glowing softly in the light of the archaeologist's lamps as if it had been waiting precisely for this moment. The fifth was silver, brilliant and pristine, marked by the ordinary degradation of time. The sixth was lead, heavy and dark, sealed in a way that suggested its contents were of particular importance or danger. And the seventh metal that could not be identified. Not by visual inspection, not by chemical analysis, not by any modern scientific method. What was it? The question hangs in the darkness of that chamber as it has hung for 2,000 years. The vessels contained residue, traces, chemical compounds that analysis could partially identify, traces of minerals, of plant matter, of substances whose origins remain mysterious. But the complete picture eluded the researchers. What had been in these vessels? What had been preserved so carefully? What knowledge or substance or capability was considered so precious, or so dangerous, that it required eternal preservation in sealed darkness? Whispers tell us that the chamber's very construction suggests profound knowledge. The arrangement of the vessels mirrors the arrangement of planets in ancient cosmology. The metals themselves each correspond to celestial bodies in alchemical tradition: copper to Venus, tin to Jupiter, iron to Mars, gold to the Sun, silver to the Moon, lead to Saturn. The seventh metal, unidentifiable to modern science, might correspond to something beyond the known planetary system, something that ancient practitioners perceived but modern instruments cannot detect. Some believe that this chamber was an alchemical laboratory, not in the crude sense that the word alchemy sometimes carries, the desperate scrambling of charlatans trying to transmute lead into gold through primitive chemistry. Rather, alchemy understood in its truest sense, a sophisticated spiritual practice that used metallurgy, chemistry, and the manipulation of physical substances as a method for mapping and developing consciousness itself. Beneath the silence, a deeper understanding emerges. Alchemy, properly understood, was not about the material transformation of metals. Or rather, it was about that, but only as a symbolic and practical expression of a far greater work, the transformation of consciousness. The seven metals were not incidental to the work. They were essential. Each metal carried particular frequencies, particular resonances, particular relationships to the human organism and the human psyche. Copper, with its properties of conductivity. Gold, with its inertness and its relationship to light. Iron, with its association to blood and vital force. Silver, with its reflective properties and association to the lunar, the intuitive. Lead, with its density and gravity. And the seventh, that unknown metal carrying qualities that modern consciousness has not yet learned to perceive or name. The exploration ventures into historical accounts of alchemical practice that have been dismissed as superstition or proto-scientific fumbling. Yet read with proper understanding. These accounts describe something extraordinarily sophisticated. They describe the deliberate use of substance and process to induce particular states of consciousness. They describe the understanding that consciousness is not separate from matter, but intimately woven through it. That by working with particular materials, in particular ways, at particular times, a practitioner could facilitate their own transformation, could elevate their consciousness to states of perception and understanding that ordinarily remain inaccessible. What if the ancients who sealed these seven vessels understood something we have lost? What if they knew that by combining the seven metals in particular ways, by creating vessels that contain particular substances, by arranging them according to celestial and terrestrial harmonies, they could create a technology not mechanical, but alchemical, for consciousness transformation? What if the preservation of these vessels was not about preserving physical objects, but about preserving the knowledge encoded within them? A knowledge that could only be activated when humanity was ready, when we had evolved sufficiently to understand what they were trying to teach us. The emotional arc moves through fascination into profound respect, because standing before these vessels, understanding the sophistication of their construction, recognizing the intentionality that guided their creation, we are forced to confront a truth we have resisted. Our ancestors may have understood the relationship between material substances and spiritual development in ways we have dismissed as superstition. They may have possessed technologies not mechanical, but alchemical, consciousness-based that we have lost. And the loss of this knowledge represents not merely a historical curiosity, but a genuine impoverishment of human possibility. It is said that those who have spent time studying these 7 vessels report a strange sensation, that merely being in their presence produces a subtle shift in consciousness, a tingling in the skin, a slight alteration in perception, as if the vessels, even sealed, even empty of their original contents, are still emanating something. Still working, still reaching across the gulf of millennia to touch something within the human organism that remembers what it was like to be in relationship with such knowledge. The final reflection settles into meditation on the nature of sealed knowledge. These vessels were sealed not to be lost, but to wait. They were preserved not in secret shame or fear that humanity would misuse their contents, but in the hope that someday, when we had grown sufficiently, when our consciousness had developed to the necessary point, we would find them again, and we would understand what they contain, and we would be ready to use that knowledge wisely. Perhaps the chamber itself is a message. The 7 metals arranged like planets. The unknown script waiting to be deciphered. The unidentifiable residue suggesting that the ancients were working with substances and principles that our current scientific framework cannot yet encompass. All of it saying, we knew something. We preserved it carefully. We sealed it against the time when humanity was not ready. But we left it for you, for the moment when you might become ready. And so the question persists. Hanging in the darkness, are we yet ready to know what is sealed in this chamber? Are we prepared to understand alchemy not as superstition, but as a sophisticated technology of consciousness? Are we willing to acknowledge that our ancestors may have understood the relationship between matter and spirit in ways that our modern compartmentalization of knowledge has made nearly impossible for us to grasp? Perhaps, whispers the darkness as sleep approaches, the 7 vessels are still sealed for a reason. Perhaps they wait not because we are unworthy, but because we are not yet prepared. Perhaps when humanity finally develops the consciousness, the humility, the wisdom necessary to receive what they contain, the seals will open of themselves, and we will finally understand what knowledge was preserved, what transformation was intended, what the ancients were trying to teach us about the sacred marriage of matter and spirit. What is waiting, still, in sealed darkness, for us to become ready? The Archive of Names, a civilization that recorded only identity, a chapter for those who wonder what it means to simply exist. Imagine entering a vast chamber carved into stone. The walls are lined with shelves, not grand shelves, not elaborate or decorated, simple, functional, and upon those shelves, stretching back into shadow, are tablets, thousands of them, clay tablets, aged to the color of ancient bone. Each one bears writing so precise, so consistent, that at first, you think perhaps they are copies, duplicates. But as you look closer, studying tablet after tablet, you begin to perceive the variations. Each one is unique. Each one bears a different name, and sometimes, beneath the name, a few additional marks, a symbol, a phrase, a sequence of numbers whose meaning remains opaque. But the central fact is always the same, a name. One name per tablet, one identity, carefully recorded, preserved in clay, held in the keeping of this civilization with a reverence that seems almost sacred. And the question emerges softly like incense rising in stillness. What civilization was so focused on the simple fact of individual existence that it recorded little else? It is said that in a valley in North Africa, a region known for its sophisticated ancient cultures, its monuments and artifacts and evidence of grandeur, archaeologists discovered something that did not fit the patterns they expected. Not a palace, not temples dedicated to gods, not granaries recording surplus or treasuries accounting for wealth. Instead, an archive, a vast, systematic collection, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets. And the purpose of each tablet was singular and absolute, to record a name, to say, in permanence, in clay, a language of preservation itself. This person existed. This identity mattered. This being was witnessed and honored. Whispers tell us that the city itself bore signs of sophistication. There were structures for gathering. There were what appeared to be places of learning. There was evidence of trade, of exchange with neighboring peoples. But what dominated the city, what consumed the resources and attention of its people, was the archive. The vast collection of names. The systematic, patient, meticulous recording of identity. There was no apparent hierarchy in how the names were recorded. No distinction between what we might call nobility and common folk. No indication that some names were more important than others. Instead, each tablet received the same care, the same precision. Each name was rendered in the same hand, with the same reverence. Whether the person was a child or an elder, whether they held power or not, whether they were remembered by other civilizations or completely unknown, none of this mattered. What mattered was the simple fact of their being, the irreducible reality of their existence. Some believe that this civilization had developed something extraordinary, a spiritual or philosophical system in which identity itself was sacred. Not identity as we might understand it in modern terms, the accumulation of achievements, of roles, of status and position. Rather, identity understood as the essential fact of being, the simple, profound reality that a person was, that they breathed, that they moved through the world with consciousness, that they perceived and experienced and existed in their own singular way. In such a system, the greatest act would not have been to build monuments or accumulate wealth or conquer territory. The greatest act would have been to be truly, fully oneself. And the greatest service to civilization would not have been to perform functions or produce goods or maintain hierarchies. Rather, it would have been to recognize and honor the unique identity of every person. To see them, to acknowledge them, to say, through the act of recording their name in clay and permanence, in sacred witness, you are, you matter, your being in this world makes a difference. Beneath the silence, the exploration deepens into what such a civilization might have actually looked like. What would it mean to organize a society around the recognition of individual identity rather than around function or hierarchy? How would decisions be made? How would resources be allocated? How would the ordinary work of maintaining a civilization be accomplished if everyone's primary identity was not their role, but simply themselves? Perhaps there were no rulers in the sense we understand rulers. Perhaps leadership was understood not as domination, but as service to the collective recognition. Perhaps there were no classes, no rulers and ruled, no wealthy and poor, no powerful and powerless. Instead, there might have been a society in which everyone was understood as equal in the way that mattered most, in their fundamental right to exist, to be witnessed, to be honored simply for being. Perhaps the work of civilization was organized not through coercion or hierarchy, but through something else entirely. Through the understanding that when you truly see another person, when you recognize their essential identity and honor it, they are moved to contribute not from obligation, but from gratitude, from the deep human gratification of being recognized, from the spiritual practice of witnessing and being witnessed. The deep investigation considers whether such a society could have actually functioned, or whether we are encountering something more symbolic, a ceremonial or spiritual practice, rather than a description of literal daily life. Perhaps the archive of names was not a practical recording system for governing or economics, but a spiritual technology, a way of practicing the fundamental recognition of identity, a ritual performed repeatedly, tablet by tablet, name by name, as a meditation on what it means to truly see another being. Or perhaps, and this possibility whispers most insistently, perhaps it was both. Perhaps such a civilization understood something that we have lost, that the deepest recognition and the most practical necessity are not separate things, that seeing and honoring identity is not merely spiritual practice, but the foundation upon which a truly functional society must be built. The emotional arc is one of profound tenderness. Imagine a people so wise that they understood that existence itself was the deepest accomplishment, that being fully present, being fully oneself, was the highest calling, that no amount of achievement or accumulation could compare to the simple, sacred reality of being witnessed and honored. Imagine a civilization that built its primary institution, its archive, Its repository of meaning, not to record what people did, but to acknowledge that they were. What grief there is in contemplating what we have lost. Modern civilization has grown so concerned with what people do, with function and role and productivity, that we have almost entirely forgotten the sacred practice of simply witnessing each other, of honoring the fact of another's existence, of saying, without qualification, "You are. That is enough. You matter because you are." The final reflection settles into meditation on presence and witness. These clay tablets, silent and simple, whisper across the ages to us. They carry a message that is almost unbearably gentle. You are. That is enough. You matter. That is all that matters. In our complex civilization, we have built systems to record what people accomplish, what they produce, what they own, what power they wield. But we have lost the simple, sacred act of recording that they existed, of honoring the irreducible fact of their being. These tablets remind us that there was once a people who understood that the greatest service civilization could offer was witness, recognition, the simple, profound act of seeing each person and saying, "You are known. You are honored. Your existence matters." Perhaps, whispers the darkness as sleep approaches, that civilization did not survive because they understood something that could not be sustained in a world that values doing more than being. Perhaps they were overcome by peoples who had learned to organize around function and hierarchy and power. Perhaps that's how we came to forget. But their tablets remain, silent testimony, an invitation, a question that echoes through the ages. What would it mean if we remembered? What would it mean if, in all our complexity, we returned to the simple practice of witnessing and honoring identity? What would it mean if, like that ancient people, we believed that the greatest act was not to build monuments, but to recognize the sacred fact that another person is? You are. That is all that matters. And somewhere in the valley in North Africa, thousands of clay tablets rest in the keeping of the earth. Each one still whispering a single person's name, still honoring their being, still performing the sacred act of witness, still waiting for us to remember.